So I was really lucky to be able to give a draft of this presentation to the women's gathering that happened before the conference. So most of the women here have seen it already, and I was really lucky to be able to benefit from their experiences and their feedback after I showed it to them first. So my name's Rachel, and I was a teenage liberal. A little more about me for people who don't already know me very well. I'm 23. I graduated with a women's studies minor from a pretty typical women's studies program at a mainstream university, which I'll go on to say doesn't really mean very much, but if it's important to you, I do have some kind of sanctioned background. I wasn't only a teenage liberal, I was a 20-year-old liberal on the topic of gender. And then I was a 21-year-old liberal on the topic of gender. And then my liberalism started to fall apart. And it wasn't all at once. I don't think minds change overnight. I don't think learning happens overnight. It took me a while to weed out that liberalism from my activist practice, and I think the liberal view of gender was the last thing I had to kind of exercise from my brain in terms of liberalism. It sticks hard, and that's one of the reasons why I feel like this presentation and the way we framed it and what Jessica and Lexi have said is so important, because I think we understand, the idea behind this presentation is that we understand why liberalism, especially in terms of gender, is so compelling. I still can understand that. And that's one of the reasons that I'm excited that we did it this way. So through my work with DGR, but also before that, I was a feminist activist before I was an environmental activist. DGR is actually the first environmentally activist group that I've ever been affiliated with. Before that, it was all feminism and women's reproductive rights. But I said that to say that I've had a lot of conversations about gender. And I've had them from the liberal perspective, and I've had them from the radical perspective since I've gone on to spend a lot of time doing public speaking for DGR. But overall that time of having conversations about gender, I feel like I've developed a kind of standardized approach to beginning those conversations. They don't always go in the same direction. Everyone's different. But I can begin them the same way. So if I feel like I need to bring up the topic of gender, or if someone else is tending towards the topic of gender, I've got to stop them right there. And I just have one question that I've got to have answered, and that is, what is your definition of gender? Because if I don't understand your definition of gender, and you don't understand my definition of gender, you can bet your bottom dollar that that conversation is not going to be productive. Because if you're using two different definitions of gender, you're not even speaking the same language when it comes to feminism. That's the core of it. So it took me a while to figure that out. And I think I'm still figuring it out because I'm still having those conversations. But this is where I've gotten so far. So today I'm going to frame this within the personal shift that I experienced with regard to my definition of gender. Like I said, I was a teenage liberal. But I also want to talk about the larger implications for our activism and for our political practice of these two differing ideas of gender, because ideas have material consequences when we act on them. And since in the past year, maybe year and a half, when I've been doing DGR activism, you would think that a group advocating the forcible dismantling of civilization would, I don't know, maybe find that to be the most controversial topic that you bring up. But no. Nope. It's gender every single time. It's contentious enough that it's the only reason, as far as I know, that we've had DGR chapters defect from the organization. We've been denied an audience at speaking events and venues because of the view that we take on gender. And Lier, who's unflinchingly vocal on the topic, has received threats of violence and death threats because she does not hold back with her view of gender. So I'm really glad to be able to give some explanation to a topic that I feel like has been widely misunderstood and mischaracterized, both by the wider activist community and within DGR itself. And if there are misunderstandings about what I say today, I'm really happy to answer questions, as are other members of the Women's Caucus that are here. I think that's extremely important, and I want to be clear, though, I'm not presenting this topic for debate. Not in the slightest. This isn't only my opinion. This represents DGR's policy, and it has actually happened that people have joined DGR with the intention specifically of shifting our view of gender or challenging the Women's Caucus and women in leadership on their radical view of gender. and it failed miserably. It will again if it's tried again, because this is the core of DGR. This is the reason I joined DGR. This is the reason that the women I look up to are in DGR. And if it was changed, we would all leave. And then where would you be? So I wanted to get that out of the way first. So characterizing these two definitions of gender is very simple on the surface, but I don't want to stay on the surface. I could say one's liberal, one's radical, but what does that mean? So today I want to unpack these two definitions of gender according to what those implications of liberal and radicalism actually mean in terms of the material effect that we're likely to have on women's lives. But I also want to talk about some of the light bulb moments, the personal experiences that I've had that shifted my view on gender. It wasn't just reading a book. Things happen that shape your opinion, and I think that describing those things is the best way I know of to explain to you why I feel the way I do. So we have this word gender, and there are two definitions of it that are out there, and I've kind of distilled these from conversations I've had. Really, there's not a lot of variation. Either someone tells me one of these or they tell me the other one of these. They don't really mix elements, and that's really interesting to me, that it's really one or the other. It's very polarizing. So in the first definition, gender, often called gender identity, is a personal, individual quality possessed by each person. Gender identity is a subjective perception by an individual of their position on a spectrum between masculine and feminine, which are both neutral attributes politically. Gender is performed outwardly through choice of markers or symbols like demeanor, body language, aesthetic choices like hair, clothing, presence or absence of makeup, pronoun. These outward markers are what govern whether an individual regards you as male or female upon meeting you or interacting with you. Each person has an innate gender identity characterized with the words masculine or feminine, or in between, which is independent of their biological sex. Each person is born with a biological sex, male, female, intersex, which is also apolitical in this definition. Sex and gender are not necessarily connected. So what is oppressive about it, according to people who adhere to this definition? Well, the fact that it's a binary system in the dominant culture, the fact that upon birth you are socialized as either masculine or feminine, generally that's seen as the primary gender oppression in this definition of gender. So that system punishes anyone who doesn't conform to either one of those binary options. And it follows that this oppresses both women and men. It oppresses whoever is put into either one of those boxes, no matter why they're put into it or what happens to them. So how can we resist? Genderqueer women and men reject the binary system, identify as gender outlaws, and demand recognition for a range of gender identities with masculine on one end and feminine on the other. So in this definition, it's turned from a binary to a spectrum. So the two ends of the binary just get stretched out, and we can see some more options in between. So this is the first definition. The second definition, gender is a hierarchical system which maintains the subordination of females as a class to males through force. Gender is a material system of power which uses violence and psychological coercion to exploit female labor, sex, reproduction, emotional support, etc. for the benefit of males. Gender is not natural or voluntary, since a person is not naturally subordinate and no one chooses to be subordinated. Biological sex is a physical feature of each person, and those deemed female upon birth are socialized into the culture as feminine, into femininity, which in this definition, femininity is defined as ritualized displays of submission to males. So why is this oppressive? Because it oppresses a class of people, and because there are oppressors. So power is wielded by groups of people. It's experienced by individuals, yes, but it's wielded by groups of people over other groups of people, and gender is no different. And how can we resist? Women organize to overthrow male power and thus the entire gender system. So instead of stretching out those binaries so there's a spectrum in between, this definition advocates for the abolition of that system of domination and oppression. So instead of ideally there being more than two different gender identifications, in this definition there would be none, because without patriarchy there would be no need for gender. Anyone want to guess which of these I'm going to characterize as liberal? I mean, I ask it as a serious question because I feel like when I read them, if I kind of step back and, let go of the fact that I do have my mind made up, I do have a clear conviction with regard to this, the first thing that jumps out at me about the first one is the fact that it emphasizes individualism. So that's the first thing that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to spend a while on it because I think that's the core of liberalism with environmentalism, and it's the core of liberalism in gender too. So again, we have this word gender, and you'll notice that this looks kind of like a Venn diagram, but the circles don't overlap at all. And that's because I don't think these two definitions of gender have anything to do with each other. I think they use the same word to describe two contradictory definitions. And I will explain why. So I'll start with the liberal view, and I picked a quote for each of these that I feel like sums it up very well. So with this one, the quote is, and that is Judith Butler, who I spent a lot of time reading in school. She's a very prominent queer theorist, and she's one that gets quoted a lot. I think her ideas sum up very well the liberal definition of gender, so I'm going to refer to her quite a bit. So this quote really embodies that individualism for me. So we start with individualism. So on the liberal side, gender is seen as a personal individual quality and thusly politically neutral. The individual is held up as so sacred in our pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of dominant culture that it's not politically correct to criticize or investigate anyone's gender. And that leads to a lot of arguments, because if you try to analyze it politically, people get offended on an individual basis. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to draw connections between how we see gender individually and the class issues that affect material reality. So with liberal environmentalism, we see this individualism as the supposed ability of individuals to affect change just by changing themselves. I'm going to buy something different. I'm going to wear hemp clothing. I'm going to reduce my carbon footprint, and that's going to help get rid of this system or change the system that's causing environmental destruction in the first place. And the logical conclusion of that is withdrawalism. If we just move ourselves out of that system entirely, then we're not contributing to it at all. But the problem with that, as all of you in DGR know, is that just because you're supposedly not contributing to it doesn't mean you're contributing to the dismantling of it. Mm-hmm. And the same thing seems to be happening with gender, where a term that Judith Butler coined is the gender outlaw, which is a really attractive idea when you're a teenage liberal, because it puts that power supposedly in your own hands. If I just stop conforming personally to these systems or to these attributes that are connected to these systems, then the system will wither and die without me, right? Or at least I can personally escape the effects of it if I just don't enact it in my own life. So again, a gender outlaw is someone who, if it wasn't clear, abandons the gender stereotypes and the gender symbols that are traditional for their biological sex and adopts them that are assigned to the other sex. So I do want to be very clear that I don't really care how someone dresses. I don't really care how they cut their hair or whether they wear makeup. Personally, it doesn't really affect me. I don't really think it's political, but I do have a problem with people postulating that it is a political act of resistance in and of itself. Dressing as or appearing as the traditional gender stereotype of the opposite sex is no more effective than living in a hut in the woods somewhere and expecting civilization to go on by itself. It doesn't make any political difference on its own. But I don't mind, I don't have any criticism of people individually. So in the liberal view, like I said, gender oppression is defined as social restrictions on individual capacity to express their true gender. So it's not one class oppressing the other. It's individuals can't express themselves. They're prevented from doing that. And that's seen as the primary gender oppression. And again, when I was a liberal, this was really attractive because it left it all up to me. If I wanted to escape gender, I could do it. But it wasn't all up to me. And the idea that it is all up to me is as insulting as it is preposterous, because no one, including me, would ever choose a role that involves constant sexual harassment, the ubiquitous threat, and in my case, occasional enactment of male violence, and the certainty growing up, the conviction that you were meant for exploitation, erasure, silence, but never personhood. And I don't think any of us think that anyone would choose that. And I'm not sure why, to most of the left, that's different when it comes to gender, but it seems to be. Here too, like I can say that, but I've also so far avoided being, beaten, sold, or killed by men. So as women go, I'm pretty lucky. And the fact that I can still identify that class oppression in my own life really tells you something, since I've been that lucky. So I got to college and read things like Judith Butler. And the idea that I could change my outlook on life, change my own perceptions to escape what feminine socialization was doing to me, was really too tempting to resist. I understand why younger women, younger men, younger people are really attracted to that. But I was wrong. And I was wrong because gender is not an individual choice, and there was not something wrong with me. Gender is class oppression of females. Okay, so I want to stop here and talk about this, because individualism too, I'm going to talk about this throughout, but I want to start talking about it with individuality. So I'll repeat something I said earlier. In order to be an outlaw, there has to be a law. And in the case of gender outlaws, that law is patriarchy. That system of values and that law is the class oppression of females. So in order for gender outlawism and people describing themselves as trans to make sense, there has to be a majority in order for that minority to exist. And that majority is cis women, of which I count myself among them. Or more accurately, I don't, because I think that term is oppressive to females on multiple levels. Because it describes female people that have capitulated, in this view, to enacting feminism. We're taking the easy way out, girls. We're enacting that role that we're supposed to enact. And we're privileged because of that, because being socialized into a role of femininity that encodes subordination so deep in your identity that you don't call it that. You call it your nature. You call it your religion. You call it your culture. I don't think that's a privilege. And I find it ridiculous a lot of the time that I have to describe the fact that that's not a privilege. Okay, next one. So we'll go over gender according to radical feminists, and I'll talk about the class issues as opposed to individualism in a second. But first I have this quote, which I hope I can read. It's become popular in some activist circles to embrace notions from postmodernism, and that includes the idea that gender is somehow a binary. Gender is not a binary, it is a hierarchy. It is global in its reach, it is sadistic in its practice, and it is murderous in its completion. Just like race and just like class, gender demarcates the geopolitical boundaries of patriarchy, which is to say that it divides us in half. That half is not horizontal, it is vertical. And in case you missed up this part, men are always on top. I can envision the anti-DGR, anti-radical feminism kind of party line being, oh, of course you'd quote Leah Keith. Of course you would. And, I would. And part of that is because she's my friend and because I appreciate her. But it was also because she was the first person that I heard say something like this, and that is why it had such an effect on me. And this encapsulates to me the class issues that come into radical feminism. Can you hit the next one next? So group class. So for radicals, gender itself is oppression. And I'll repeat that. Without gender, or without oppression, there cannot be gender. They're one and the same when it comes to sex oppression of females. So for radical feminists, gender is the chain and patriarchy is the ball, and it's cuffed to the ankle of every female person born. That socialization is not escapable, even if you move to that hut in the woods. If you have a TV, it's there. If you know men that have been socialized into this culture, it's there. If you have a mother who is socialized as feminine, it's there. And that's what makes it a class issue. So I could not escape gender by changing myself, because changing my appearance did not change the fact that I was socialized into the sex class called women against my will. And the fear and desperation that comes from that is not something that someone would choose, and it was not my fault. But even after I realized that, it took me a few years to hold my head up when I walked. And most days I still have to put conscious effort toward it. So when people postulate that gender is individual, that my individual identity involves walking like you're about to be kicked or holding your head down when you speak. That's offensive, and you can't put it any other way, because no one chooses that identity, no one is innately subordinate. So it's not a coincidence that 91% of those who are raped are female and 99% of the perpetrators are male. It's not a coincidence that the shoes make it hard to run away. It's taboo to acknowledge that females are socialized from birth onward into a subordinate sex class for whom exploitation by males is so ingrained into the social norms that we can't recognize it anymore, that it's become a choice, that it's become our identity. So it's taboo within mainstream liberal feminism to address the fact that males are socialized from birth onward into a privileged sex class that feeds on violation and subordination of not only women, but, as all of you can recognize, of the oceans, of the earth, of life itself. So people who are critical of DGR's feminist stance often seem unaware that Lear isn't the only radical feminist in the organization. And far from it, but because she is a woman who doesn't hedge her words, doesn't hold her tongue, and really doesn't accept liberal bullshit, she's become kind of a lightning rod for the type of flack that radical feminism tends to get. And I find that unfair, first of all. And a lot of that flack comes from actually a private email that she sent that got spread all over the internet. And when people criticize DGR based on the text of that email, they seem to expect us to be so ashamed of it or so offended by it ourselves that we won't even address it. So I'd actually like to read it out loud. Could you hit the next slide? Well, I've personally been fighting about this since 1982. I think transphobic is a ridiculous word. I have no strange fear of people who claim to be trans. I deeply disagree with them, as do most radical feminists. Try this on. I am a rich person stuck in a poor person's body. I've always enjoyed champagne rather than beer, and I always knew I belonged in first class, not economy. And it just feels right when people wait on me. My insurance company should give me $1 million to cure my economic dysphoria. Or how about this? I am really Native American. How do I know? I've always felt a special connection to animals. I started building teepees in the backyard as soon as I was old enough. I insisted on wearing moccasins to school, even though the other kids would make fun of me. And my parents punished me. And I read everything I could on Native people. I started going to powwows and sweat lodges as soon as I was old enough, and I knew that that was the real me. If you bio-Indians don't accept us trans Indians, then you are just as genocidal and oppressive as the Europeans. Gender is no different. It is a class condition created by a brutal arrangement of power.
Yeah.
So I'd like to actually follow that comparison a little further to maybe make it a little clearer. So I've asked, at first out of genuine curiosity when people would bring this up, why, if gender is something that socialization doesn't matter, it's voluntary, you can be transgendered, or in the more specific case, a trans woman. Why is that acceptable when deciding that I'm trans black is not? And I just want to follow it through. So what would it mean if I was trans black, if I decided that was true? Would it mean that I wore clothes that are traditionally and stereotypically believed to be those worn by African Americans? Would it mean that I identify more strongly with African culture than I do with white culture? No. And I don't think I really have to explain why, because that's offensive. I don't have the cultural background that makes that true. I have not endured the oppression and abuse that goes along with being a marginalized racial class. And so for me to claim that I more strongly identify with that is actually just reinforcing those stereotypes. And I honestly don't really see what's different about gender. If we accept that gender is a class condition, not an individual condition, that analogy makes sense. People told me about these before I actually read them, and once I actually read them, I was kind of underwhelmed because I didn't really see what was so not straightforward about calling gender a class position. This was after I kind of left the liberalism a little bit. So next we can talk about idealism. So on the liberal side, gender is idealist. And this is a quote from Jennifer Baumgartner, who I used to idolize. I went and saw her speak. She's a very nice woman. She does a lot of really good work. But she says that consciousness is everything. Even now, acknowledging inequality begs one to do something about it, and that is a daunting, albeit righteous, responsibility. So the idea that consciousness is everything, just like with environmentalism, leads to an activist practice that's focused on changing people's minds, as though oppression were a mistake that could be corrected if we could just explain to men that they should really just stop exploiting us. It begs us to do something about it because we're the ones affected by it. But the realization that they're benefiting from the oppression of others leads the oppressor class to dig in their heels, not to do something about it. So even liberal feminists, I like to use the example of rape culture to kind of get away from idealism, because rape is not an idea. Again, there's a reason why 91% of rape victims are female and 99% of the perpetrators are male. So if she's lucky, the survivor of rape will be one of the 2% that their case actually goes to trial. And 97% of rapists never see a day in jail. And these are not ideas, they are reality. But when we're talking about rape culture and idealism, we have to talk about slut walk. Can you go to the next slide? I give you one guess who this intrepid young feminist is. Do the curls give me away? So I'm not sorry that I participated in this. I actually organized the one at my school because I think that, just like me, the women that participate in this genuinely want to end rape culture, because what woman wouldn't? The fallacy, and the one that I fell into, I was 21 in this picture, was that changing people's ideas about rape culture would actually change rape culture. It says end rape culture in marker. So the fallacy here is not wanting to end rape culture. The fallacy is that marching around with end rape culture on my back was actually going to end rape culture. So again, it's based on the idea that we can change people's ideas about what gender means. If we just redefine the term slut, then it won't be an oppressive term to women anymore. But what we forget is that the lines of oppression are not demarcated by the oppressed. They are chosen by the oppressor, and they can only be changed through force, not through catchy chants, which is a shame because I'm really good at catchy chants. So for radicals, gender is maintained through force. Gender is a material system of power which uses violence and psychological coercion to exploit female labor, sex, reproduction, emotional support for the benefit of men. So rape culture, right along with female poverty, lack of education, the traffic in our bodies, it's maintained through material structures, not through people's ideas. Gender is a system of power, like I said, that uses violence and psychological coercion to maintain the oppression of females. Not to just control our ideas about it, but to control actual physical reality. So next on the liberal side we have voluntarism, and this again gets back to the heart of the controversy of DGR around feminism. And that is our policy surrounding women's spaces and how that relates to people who describe themselves as trans. So I, again, feel sad that I have to put this as a disclaimer, but through my time speaking in public for DGR, we've been asked, are we a transphobic organization? Do we hate trans people? And I can only speak for myself when I say that I do not hate trans people as a group of people. I don't hate the individual trans people that I know, and that has nothing to do, my personal feelings towards individuals has nothing to do with my political analysis of what that definition of gender means for all of us and for people as a class. So in the liberal view, gender expression, I took this off the HRC website, gender expression is seen as a voluntarily chosen set of external characteristics and behaviors that are socially defined as either masculine or feminine, such as dress, grooming, mannerisms, speech patterns, or social interactions. So what follows from this is that if gender is voluntary, then people who are oppressed by gender are choosing to be oppressed. And I come back again to the fact that no one chooses to be oppressed. And if we accept this definition of gender, we accept that people who are oppressed for being born female are choosing to be in that position, and that if they wanted to, they could reject that and move away from it by their own personal choices and do something else. And I think back to a person that I met who identified themselves to me as a trans woman. And again, this person was very sweet. I was very glad to meet them. I don't mean this as a personal attack. But something that they said really stuck with me as a demonstration. And they said, I don't have the male privilege that I was raised with anymore. And I had to think about that for a while, to think about what I thought about that and whether that was true. And I realized that it wasn't. because being raised with male privilege is the privilege. Being raised with the knowledge that you are fully human and you deserve rights and that your body is not fair game and that the court system considers you human is the privilege. And that doesn't just go away. So an alternative name for this presentation is I'm not afraid of your penis, but I'm terrified of your socialization. Because I think that people think, when I say things like this, that I consider males innately terrifying, that just you'll never get out of it. I've seen men get out of that system of behavior. But getting out of being socialized into masculinity, which is based on violation and domination, does not make you female. It makes you a revolutionary, because that is what is actually going to change the culture, are people acting outside. Okay. First I want to talk about this. So this is a quote from Courtney Mitchell, who, maybe he's on live stream right now, I'm not sure, I hope he is. But he wrote an essay called On White Privilege and Backlash. And he wrote that it's important to understand what it means to view racial oppression in the context of class analysis. Whiteness is a class experience and not based in biological reality. But that does not mean that one can just decide to stop being white, just like I cannot decide to stop being a man, as long as the dominant culture classes me as a man. As long as you are classed as white, you will continue to benefit from white privilege. This is what allies need to remember. And if you put this in the context of gender oppression, it is just as true. This is what allies need to remember, is that whatever your intentions are, whatever your external presentation is, you are going to have that socialization and therefore that privilege and that identification by the dominant culture as long as you live. Just like as long as I live, I will have to think about my posture so I'm not hiding. I will have to speak extra loud most of the time in order to counteract the social forces that tell me not to speak at all. So none of that is going to change just because I want it to. None of that is voluntary like it is on the liberal side. One more time. Okay, so now I want to talk about a kind of conflict that I've seen within liberal feminism. So I don't think oppression is natural or voluntary. But on the liberal side, oppression is both natural and voluntary. And this is because gender is seen as both natural, something innate that we're born with, and something that we choose from the wardrobe of gender every day, like clothes. And it's hard to argue from a radical perspective because liberals kind of have the market cornered on the naturalism and voluntarism. They can argue it from both sides and switch in the blink of an eye. And I am having a really hard time figuring out how to point it out that this is a basic conflict of logic. If something is innate, it cannot be voluntary. My brown hair is innate, therefore it's not voluntary. And the same goes for gender. It can't be both, and in my view, it's neither. So next is constructivism. So instead of being natural, in the radical view, gender is constructed. It is artificial. It is imposed on humans who would enact humanity if given the choice. But instead, this constructed identity of subordination and domination is impressed upon us. So this quote is from Andrea Dworkin. Woman is not born, she is made. In the making, her humanity is destroyed. She becomes a symbol of this, symbol of that, mother of the earth, slut of the universe, but she never becomes herself because she is forbidden to do so. So for females, this is the reality of the construction of gender, is that it's not escapable. Just because it's constructed doesn't mean that it can be deconstructed at will. It doesn't mean that it can be deconstructed individually. In order to deconstruct it, it will take organization, which is something that has not happened on a mass scale yet, and that's why patriarchy still exists. So the thing that brought this home to me was my relationship with a student I used to have. So we went over basic sex ed, we went over self-esteem, media literacy. A lot of the time we just talked about these things, talked about our experiences of gender and of being a teenager in this culture. And I met a girl named, and she had been subject to incest, trafficking, rape, more horrific incidences than I could comprehend. She may have been the most horrifically abused that I had ever met in that context. And part of the time that I knew her, she already had short hair, she cut it a little shorter, she asked me to use the pronoun he, which I also did. So I didn't really think very deeply about that at the time. At the time, if you had asked me why did she do that, I would have said, well, it's her innate gender identity. She was born wanting to do that. Now that she's away from her parents and in this institution, she feels like she can without repercussion, and this is a good thing because she can enact what is actually her. But I don't believe that anymore. And one of the reasons I don't believe that is because one of the days in class, I asked them to draw a picture, all of my students. I knew what I thought they deserved, but I wanted to know what they thought they deserved, what they wanted their lives to be like when they got out, what their lives would be like if they had gotten what they wanted and what they needed throughout their lives. And they drew a lot of different things, but I kept this drawing for a really long time. So in one corner, she drew what was clearly a girl's face. It had pink lipstick, it had a pink bow in the hair, and it had tears running down the face, and it had a big X through it. And underneath it, she wrote words that she thought described being a girl. She wrote pain, she wrote fear, she wrote rape, she wrote words in that vein. In the other corner, she drew a human face. In fact, it looked a lot like her. It had short brown hair, no makeup or accessories, and the face was smiling. And underneath it, she wrote confidence, she wrote happy, she wrote safe. And underneath that, she wrote me a paragraph, and it started with, if I hadn't been a girl, if I wasn't a girl, I wouldn't have been raped. If I wasn't a girl, I wouldn't be scared. If I wasn't a girl, I wouldn't be here as the institution. So I kept that for a while because I didn't really understand it right away. It took a while for that to sink in. And I don't bring up this example to try to convey that every person who describes themselves as trans does so because of the type of horrific abuse that she endured. I do it to assert that being socialized into femininity is abuse, and she just experienced it more extremely than most of us do. And she did what she could to get out of it at that time. But as much as I want that for her, that doesn't mean that she actually could get out. She got out of that institution, but she did not get out of femininity, no matter how short she cuts her hair, and no matter what name she uses. That gender is anything but natural. She was not born with a feminine brain or a masculine brain, but she was born with a female body. And in this culture, that means she's considered less human than members of the sex class men. And it's no wonder to me that she wanted to escape that oppression of female socialization by rejecting her femaleness. But just like Courtney said, just as men cannot erase their masculine privilege, women cannot choose to erase the oppression of being socialized into femininity. Which brings me to the final distinction between the liberal and radical conceptions of gender that I'm going to talk about today, which is the difference between reformism and revolution. So this is a long quote. I'm not going to read all of it because it's not necessary. So that's one of the things that the word queer can refer to, the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances, and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality, aren't made and can't be made to signify monolithically. So this is a quote from Eve Sedgwick, who's another really prominent queer theorist. She goes on to say that people can identify as radical fairies, pushy femmes, trans women, lesbians who sleep with men, lesbian-identified men. She goes on like that for a while. It's a long paragraph. But the point that I'm trying to get to by reading all of that academic language is that all of those identities are still based on domination and subordination. And just because we're putting extra categories in between the two does not mean that we're getting rid of the system based on the animosity between the two. So on the radical side, we have revolution. This is Catherine McKinnon. In a society in which equality is a fact, not merely a word, words of racial or sexual assault and humiliation will be nonsense syllables. And in the radical feminist view, this will be what happens to the words man and woman, along with the sex class system based on subordination and domination that those words signify. And that's it.